Hey guys, I am Game Advisor and welcome back to another Icarus video. Today we're going to be talking about what are the best and worst blueprints, as well as the ones that I personally would recommend you get while you're leveling up versus the ones that I recommend you get maybe after you've hit max level and you no longer really need anything specific. Do also keep in mind that some of these things may change over time as the game is constantly being updated. So with all that being said, let's get started. Now, first up, when you drop into the game, you're going to feel a little bit overwhelmed with how many different blueprints you probably can choose from. So what I would recommend that you go ahead and get started with are going to be things like the bow and the stone arrow. This is just simply because you need them to level up quickly via killing animals. Yes, you can use spears, but personally, I don't think they're nearly as good as being able to have a number of arrows and a bow that you can just pump out very easily, since you're still able to one-shot things with the bow, and you really do not need to have the spear for that. There are uses for the spear, however, I just don't think it's a #1 priority when you're getting into the game. Aside from that, I'd recommend you get the stone knife and the stone axe, as well as the stone pickaxe. These are just your basic tools, so you're going to need them to get started. Next up, I would recommend getting a campfire and a wood rag torch, as well as a bandage. These are just going to be critical things to keep yourself alive and give you the ability to see in the dark, as well as cook food. The campfire is going to be used for your entire playthrough, and a lot of these things in Tier 1 are going to be used for your entire playthrough of the game, but they're still important to pick up early. Next up, I'd say get a bedroll, followed by going all the way over here to the right side and researching some thatch as soon as possible. You can go down into the wood section, but you do not have to. Both are perfectly viable. I would actually say that maybe you want to get both at some point, but personally, all you really need early on is going to be the thatch. Now, as far as which pieces to choose, I'd recommend that you get the thatch beam, thatch floor, thatch wall, and thatch ramp. This is because these 4 pieces are going to be all you need to build your entire base. If you want, you can also pick up the door, which is going to of course be useful because then you don't have to break the wall and put it back every time you walk in and out of your house, but you technically don't need it. Now, as you start to hit around level 5-ish, you're going to see some other things that you'll want to craft that'll be unlocking for you. These are going to be things like your Oxidizer. This is your first source of oxygen aside from actually grinding oxide and just carrying it around. It's going to make the oxide significantly more efficient, so you don't have to grind quite as much. So I do recommend picking it up early. That way you can use it in your base as a way to store oxygen for yourself. Then you have the cloth chest armor, the cloth leg armor, cloth foot armor, cloth arm armor, and cloth head armor. The full set will give you a 5% move speed buff, as well as just giving you something very easy to craft, not just for XP, but also giving you just some very easy armor to craft that can give you a significant boost when it comes to dealing with animals. Next is going to be the bone arrow. Bone arrows are very cheap, and if you're anything like me, you're probably going to be using a bow for a very long time in Icarus. We are talking pretty much the entire playthrough. Many times you won't need guns, which we'll talk about later, but bone arrows are going to be absolutely very important since they're incredibly easy to make, and they're very, very useful for killing some of the higher level animals a little bit more efficiently and more consistently. Another thing to look into is your bone tools. These are going to be your bone knife and your bone sickle. I highly recommend the bone sickle, if only for the purpose of collecting food later on. You do not need this one right away, but it is something you should consider. You also have the bone knife, which is just going to give you an extra 50% from animals when you skin them over the stone knife, and it is very easy to make. Usually killing any animal will give you enough materials to go ahead and make this bone knife. After that, all you got to do is chop down a single tree and you've got it. Things that are optional, but I would probably say really aren't necessary, are going to be things like the floor torch, the wood torch, wood piles, stone piles, flame arrows, flare arrows, poison arrows. All of these things can be useful, and they're up to you if you want to choose them. Personally, I would just stay away from them until you know you have an excess amount of blueprint points and you just want to have those niceties. All these wooden stone piles are going to do, by the way, is give you a way to store your stone and wood in a different fashion. This way they don't take up an inventory slot or something like that. But at the end of the day, it's only one slot for 100 wood or 100 stone. If these held like 500, we'd be having a different discussion, but because that's not the case, I personally would just stay away from these blueprints entirely. They're almost just a complete waste at this point in time. The fire pit is also pretty useless if I'm being completely honest with you guys here. The fire pit is literally just a campfire with more inventory slots that cost twice as much to make. I would just say, don't bother with it. It's not worth your time. It doesn't make anything easier. It's really just not that useful. Now, over here you have, again, some more optional things. The splint, not necessary, just reduces the time that you have broken legs if you fall from a high area. The suture kit, however, you will want to have later on, but you don't need it in the very beginning because you shouldn't be getting any heavy bleeding or deep wounds, so it won't really matter. Heat bandage, once again, you might want it later on to give yourself a way to deal with being cold, but you really don't need this. It's absolutely not necessary. These pastes can be useful, but at the end of the day, all of these pastes are very rarely useful enough to warrant yourself actually carrying them around and crafting them and taking your time to make them. In fact, I would say just skip these altogether and only pick them up if you have an absolutely massive amount of extra blueprint points and you just want to spend it so you have the entire collection of blueprints. Over here, we've got the wooden storage boxes. These, again, can be useful. I find myself not really using them on many missions. If you want to, I would say maybe pick up the small one and the big one, but it's, again, they're really not necessary. I just use my workbench to store stuff, and if anything, I might once in a very rare blue moon make a small storage box and just store a few random things in there. But most missions you're going to be completing so fast that it's really just not necessary to have the extra storage space. Now, these three things here all require you to have some special talent to make. I would highly recommend you get the talent that allows you to craft sticks. It's incredibly useful. It is one of the best crafting items in the game because it lets you take one wood and turn it into 10 sticks without having to craft some of the tier 2 benches, so it can save you a lot of time on a lot of missions or even save your life depending on the situation. And that's going to pretty much cover tier 1. Let's go ahead and jump into tier 2. Tier 2 is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to start picking up the pace a bit. I'm not going to cover every single item because at this stage a lot of things are really optional. I'm just going to cover what I absolutely recommend you do take and don't take from here on out. I highly recommend that you do take the stone furnace. The stone furnace is extremely useful. It is absolutely necessary to make a vast majority of items in the game, so this should be the very first thing you pick up when you hit tier 2. Next is going to be the Oxide Dissolver. This is how you're going to fill up your O2 exotic tank that you're probably going to be taking into a lot of missions. It's incredibly useful. If you fill it up once, you're basically not going to have to touch it for the rest of the entire mission unless you happen to be doing like a 6 to 12 hour mission or you're taking an extremely long time for some reason. The Rain Dissolver, I would say don't even bother with it. There's never been a single circumstance in this game where I have actually needed to use it. It has been built before and I have built it just to see how it works, but otherwise it is just not worth your time. One exotic water canteen can be filled up at a lake or a river and it will cover you for I think like 3 or 4 hours of real life time, which is a huge amount of time. There is absolutely no reason to create this thing or even bother with your blueprint points on it. Wall torches are literally just there to light yourself on fire. Again, would highly recommend you just stay away from these. You can make them if you want, but personally, they're not worth the time. They're not worth the resources. They're just not that useful. Anvil bench, absolutely necessary. You need this to make all your weapons and you need it to make nails as well as tools. Some things to consider in here that I personally would recommend that you pick up relatively early on are going to be the iron and steel pickaxe. These are vital to some missions and they are absolutely used constantly. Until you get the exotic tier 2 pickaxe, these are going to be absolutely the most important item you can have in here aside from your furnace and anvil. The iron knife is very useful if you don't want to make the exotic knife. However, I do recommend you spend the time to get the exotic pick and knife since these two things are going to be used very often. Now, if you're like me and you bring an exotic axe, there's no reason to make an iron axe. You will probably never use it, so it's not really worth your time. However, if you don't happen to pick up the exotic one or you don't like bringing it in with you on missions, getting the iron one is nice. However, I just don't think the steel one is worth it whatsoever. It only gives you 5% more yield for significantly more resources. This one will give you 125% yield from a tree. This one will give you 130%. The 5% is not worth the time and the resource investment just to make this thing, let alone the resources you're going to gather with it. Once again, spears are up to you guys, and moving over to the end here, I would actually tell you probably stay away from the crossbow. It's not that useful. The ammo can get pretty expensive, and with a 20% break chance on some of these things, they're just not worth your time. 9 out of 10 times, just the starting bow or an exotic bow or a long bow will be more than enough to deal with literally any mission. So I would tell you to completely skip that. The iron sickle, once again, I never craft it. It's not usually worth my time. The bone sickle's more than enough and significantly cheaper and more time efficient, so I would just skip this as well for now. However, a lot of these you can come back and get if you want. The shovel, I've actually never really bothered to use. So I'm going to be honest with you. Shovel, not that useful. I would probably just stay away from it. You guys can let me know in the comments if I'm wrong on this one, but personally, it's not worth your time. The taxidermy knife is going to be required for some missions, so you might want to pick it up at some point, but this is a low priority until you hit those missions. Repair hammers are absolutely, once again, a complete waste of time. The only one I would pick up is the tier 1 wooden ones, which I actually did forget to talk about, but the tier 1 wooden repair hammer is extremely important if you ever have a base and there happens to be a storm come through, so make sure you pick up that too. Okay, back to finishing up tier 2. Other things I recommend that you pick up early because they're extremely useful. Icebox. If you're doing any mission related to food, pick this up. It allows you to put ice in it, and then it will make your food essentially last forever as long as you keep it stocked with ice. It goes through ice incredibly slowly at this stage, which may change in the future, but with that being said, it's still very, very useful. I highly recommend you pick it up if you're going to be doing anything with food whatsoever. The trophy bench is completely worthless except for the very specific missions where you have to make trophies. Otherwise, it's a totally cosmetic thing, so I would say maybe just stay away from it until you need it for a mission, unless you're going for cosmetics for whatever reason. I'm gonna be honest with crop plots, I don't think they're worth your time. Just in general, they're just not useful. There are so few missions where they're actually important that I would just never use them. I've used them on one mission, I think, and I didn't even have to use them on it. So I wouldn't even research these at this stage until farming becomes more important in the game. But, you know, you could use them if you want. It's just really up to you. Other really important things I want to talk about here are the skinning bench. The skinning bench is very important because it allows you to actually go ahead and skin animals on the bench, which will get you significantly more fur. If you're crafting for armor, or you need fur to craft bedrolls, or you need fur for any given reason, the skinning bench is going to be your go-to place. You're going to get way more from that than you will from actually skinning animals 9 out of 10 times. Longbow, absolutely vital. We've already talked about this, so I'm not going to waste your time. 100% pick it up. Flint arrows, very cheap, very useful on fast-paced missions where you just want to run in, get some iron ore, turn it into some arrows, and get going. Very useful. Highly recommend you pick this one up as well. Water skins and oxygen bladders. Honestly, pretty useless. There are very rare exceptions, but generally I would actually stay away from these since you're just going to get the exotic versions of these, which will carry significantly more anyways. We're talking like 5 to 10 times as much. The water skin also leaks, which is really annoying. So once again, I'd just stay away from them. They're not worth your blueprint points pretty much at all. You got the mortar and pestle, 100% recommend you get this. You're going to need it for just about a million different things. Do research steel bloom, carbon paste, epoxy, crushed bones, flour, and gunpowder. They're all used in different things. They're all very important. I recommend you get every single one of those. The ones that are the most important to get first are going to be steel bloom, epoxy, and probably crushed bone. The other 3 can wait for specific missions where you happen to need a firearm or you happen to need the carbon paste to make a specific thing, but you're eventually going to need all of them. Poison paste, total waste of time, just skip it. Lightning rod is incredibly useful if you're doing a long-term mission and happen to have a wooden base. However, if you're just going to go straight to stone, it's not that useful. I would say this is circumstantial. Research it when you need it. If you don't need it, don't research it. You'll probably get it at some point, but it's not a high priority one. Lantern, same thing, not high priority. You can just put a torch on the side of your hip and it works just as well as putting a lantern there. These leather curtains and doors, I'm not gonna lie, they're pretty cool, but again, total waste of time and research. Now, the Herbalism bench, 100% you are going to want this. This is extremely useful for a number of different reasons. First off, you can create the health restoration paste. This is just a way to give yourself instant HP aside from eating food. It's a nice option to have. You do not have to take it. But the one thing that you do absolutely want it for is the flatbread dough. The flatbread dough requires water and it requires 5 flour. This is a very, very cheap recipe that allows you to make a food that will give you 100% energy regeneration. It will save you time on missions. It will get you more XP. It's an incredibly useful food. It's probably the most OP food in the entire game, so I highly recommend you pick it up. You also have antibiotic tonic, which is not important necessarily, but is an option. What this is going to do is make it so whenever you're in a cave and you get that 10-minute debuff, it will go away once you drink this. This is really nice to have, but absolutely not necessary and would only be used on long-term missions. Moving down here, the textiles bench is of course going to be important, which we'll cover here in just a second. You have the leather backpack, which is optional. If you're going to get the exotic backpack, you really don't need this for any reason. But if you don't have it or don't have any plans to get it anytime soon, the leather backpack is a perfectly viable and good option. Leather armor, however, is a total waste. I'm going to be honest with you, skip it. It's not worth your time. The stats on it are not that good. Wait and go straight to fur armor. Fur armor is twice as good at protecting you, gives you more resistance to pretty much everything except heat resistance, and it gives you a cold resistance buff. The passive buff over here for the full set is only 1% health and stamina regeneration. That's like nothing. I'm going to be honest with you. It's a total waste. These I have not crafted in forever. The first set is going to be necessary for some missions, so I recommend you pick it up unless you already happen to have the exotic armor, in which case you could just ignore it. Ghillie suit, totally worthless. It looks cool, not very useful. Polar bear armor, again, it looks cool, not really useful. The fur armor is more than enough, and the amount of time you have to spend grinding polar bears is really annoying. Plus, they're not even in a lot of missions. So once again, it's just not really worth your time to craft it. Alrighty, we're almost at the end of tier 2, and the last few things we want to talk about are the carpentry bench and the masonry bench. The carpentry bench is extremely important because you may need it to make sticks, and you're going to need it to be able to craft other resources which are required for late game items. This is not absolutely necessary right away, but it is something I would recommend you pick up. Be very tentative about making sure you get it at some point. It's very useful. However, it is not absolutely necessary right away. You're going to need it when you get to tier 3 and tier 4. Masonry bench. 100% recommend you get this. These stone structures are the cheapest structures that will not die when they're in the snow biome from the snow piling up on top, as well as just being a stronger foundation. They also cannot burn down. They cannot be blown down. These are great. I would say 100% pick up the stone beam, stone floor, stone wall, and stone roof. You do not need the reinforced door at this stage, but it may become important later, so it's worth maybe picking up anyways, but again, totally optional on that part. Now, the one thing I would say to stay away from are the interior wood pieces. These do have their uses, but basically are just regular wood pieces with fancy textures. I would say totally ignore them. I'm going to be honest with you, until there's a better use, these are a complete waste of time, and I would just stay entirely away from interior wood whatsoever. Alrighty, so in tier 3 we have a few things to think about. Of course, machining bench is important. You're gonna have to pick that up to get anything anyways, but it is important to have. It's incredibly useful. Concrete furnace is what you're going to be using to craft steel. It's going to be used in crafting basically everything tier 3 and above. So you absolutely need to pick this up first after you pick up the machining bench. Otherwise, get the cement mixer because you need the cement mixer to make the concrete furnace. So these 3 should be the first things you unlock upon hitting this level. After that, if you can, I would recommend you go down this way. Don't even bother with the platinum pick. It rarely is ever useful. I don't know why I chose it. It was a total waste of time. Same with all the other platinum tools. They're really just not worth it. The only one maybe worth considering is the spear if you really like spears, but again, totally not necessary. But with that being said, you're going to want to go down here and you're going to want to get the recurve bow. The recurve bow is extremely useful on missions where you have to deal with bosses or missions where you're going to have to kill a lot of enemies. It's again not a necessary thing at this stage, but it is nice to have the option of creating a better bow when you're doing longer missions. Aside from that, the kitchen bench is incredibly useful. To craft this, you are going to need the carpentry bench we talked about earlier, which is why we said to make it, and the biofuel stove. The kitchen storage block, totally worthless, don't even bother. I don't even know why it's a thing, to be completely honest with you. If somebody could tell me, that'd be great, but it's really just a waste of space and resources. I crafted it once to see what it did and never crafted it again. With that being said though, I would recommend once again that you get the kitchen bench and the biofuel stove. This is because you'll be needing them to craft a ton of cooking recipes that are very powerful. Bread dough is very, very useful. It allows you to create an XP buff that is very useful and very cheap to make. You also have beer and you have wine. Both of these are great buffs. They give you more max stamina and stamina regeneration. When running long distances, these are going to be your best friend along with flatbread. All three of them together basically make it so you're sprinting 90% of the time, which will save you a huge amount of time when traveling. And if you know anything about Icarus, you know travel time sucks. And it sucks a lot. Otherwise, berry jam is optional, but I actually would just tell you to stay away from it, honestly. It's not that useful. It's a little bit more useful than some other things, but it's just not that big a deal. Now, as far as the rest of this stuff goes, you could get the smoke and frag grenade. The only reason you'd get the smoke grenade is to get to the frag grenade, because the smoke grenade does basically nothing unless you're PvPing your friends. But with that being said, the frag grenade can be extremely useful when dealing with things like bears or mammoths, but again is an expensive craft, so most of the time people will just entirely avoid it. Now I'm going to be honest with you, all four of these things up here in this little section are a total waste minus the dehumidifier. The dehumidifier can be extremely useful for one reason specifically, and that is so that you can build in caves. The dehumidifier will allow you to build inside caves so that you don't get the cave debuff. It is absolutely not necessary. Most people I know don't actually build in caves. It's just a really unique meta that some people do use. I just want you to understand it is not required. The oxygen tank is already going to be smaller than the one you can bring in with the exotic still, so it's just not worth picking up. The fire extinguisher is going to be so rarely used that I wouldn't even bother with it. Just get the fire whacker in tier 1. It's way easier to craft. The metal oxide dissolver is literally just going to fill up things even faster. But again, it's not that hard to farm 50 oxide, which will basically last you an entire mission. So it's just a waste of your resources. The biofuel composter is absolutely important to get. You need this in order to power your biofuel stove. You also need it to fill up biofuel cans, which will go in the stove, but you also need it so that you can fill up a ton of other things. For an example, if you want to use the biofuel deep mining drill, you're going to have a full biofuel can, which gets filled up in the biofuel composter. I think you get where this is going. There's a lot of things like that in this game that require biofuel and can really only be gained through the biofuel composter in tier 3, or if you really want to, the tier 4 one, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Alrighty, moving on to the last few things here for tier 3 we're going to talk about. Glass working bench, important but not immediately important. It is nice to have, but only for the purposes of creating the beer bottle and the wine bottle. You need those to create your beer and wine, which we talked about earlier, being some really good food buffs. Do not have to have this right away. I would say it's maybe at the end of the priority list of important things to get. So if things like the bow or the furnace were first picks, these would be like third or fourth picks maybe. It's really up to you when you get it, but you definitely are going to want to get these. As far as weapons go, I'm going to be honest with you. There are only 2 guns I would recommend you ever bother crafting, and that is the pistol and the bolt action rifle. Now, you may ask, why would I even bother creating the pistol if I'm just going to have the bolt action rifle one? Doesn't the bolt action rifle hit harder? And the short answer is yes, it does. But what people don't always think about is that the bolt action rifle costs twice as much, and the pistol can still one-shot most things in the game. So unless you're going up against mammoths, almost every single time, I would just go ahead and create the pistol. Of course, polar bears, it's nice to have a bolt action rifle against, but again, they're not required. The only gun I recommend you stay entirely away from is going to be the shotgun and the shotgun shells, of course, because they just don't do enough damage to be worth taking. Now, you can take the incendiary rifle round, but to be honest with you, it does about the same amount of damage as the regular rifle round after it hits something, and it's just not that useful. There are very specific situations where it can be, and there are very specific missions where you have to craft them, but otherwise I would say just ignore it It's really not that important until you absolutely need it for a mission or something like that. Now, one thing I didn't mention with the glass working bench was the glass blocks. The only 2 glass blocks I would recommend you pick up, and these are low priority, is the glass beam and glass wall. And that is because currently in the game, if you place a glass wall down on a structure somewhere near a crop plot, then you'll be able to increase the growth rate of that crop plot quite significantly. It's still not enough for me to use crop plots, but if you're gonna use them, I'd recommend you get the glass wall. All this other glass stuff is absolutely not necessary and is basically entirely cosmetic at this stage. Hunter armor is very debatable at best, but if I'm going to be straight with you guys, in my personal opinion, I'd say don't even bother picking it up. Hunter armor does have its uses, but here's the problem with it. You either have exotic armor probably already, or you're going to be getting exotic armor very soon. And exotic armor is straight up better than this, and you're probably going to take it into almost every single mission. So you can get this if you want. It is an expensive set of armor. Epoxy takes time to make. It is not a cheap thing to get. But with that being said, I will leave this one entirely up to you guys. Some people love this, some people hate this. So it's really your decision. I'd say if you have exotic armor, don't even bother, or if you're getting it soon, don't even bother, but that's just my personal opinion. Now, lastly, we do have aluminum structures and we do have concrete structures. Concrete is basically just fancy stone with more health, which is almost completely useless at this stage of the game. Nothing's really going to attack your structure enough to destroy a stone structure unless you're sitting AFK for like 10 minutes. But it is an option. You can make concrete structures. There are very, very small situational cases where it's useful because it does provide more insulation than stone does, but it is absolutely not necessary. Aluminum, I'm gonna be straight with you. I don't know why I would use it pretty much ever. It's pretty worthless. It's cheap to make, I guess. It gives you a resource to use all that aluminum on, but at the end of the day, they are just not worth your time. Alrighty, we are finally at tier 4, so let's talk about tier 4. Obviously, we need the fabricator. Gonna be very important since it's the only way we can get to all the other tier 4 stuff. Flashlight, currently, total waste of time. Don't bother with it. Titanium tools. If you really want, titanium pick could be useful in all the other ones if you're gonna be playing a very, very long-term mission. It is absolutely not recommended that you take any of the titanium tools, and that is simply because the odds of you actually spending that much time on a mission to go farm and craft them is so low that at this stage of the game, it's just not worth it. Now, later on, that might change, but with Icarus in its current state, I would just completely tell you, stay entirely away from titanium stuff. It's not worth your time. The spear maybe could be useful, only because if you like spears, it's a better weapon to have. Same thing goes with the bow. Same thing goes with the machete and the knives. At the end of the day, they're just so expensive to make, they're not worth it. Especially when you could just have a hunting rifle. The hunting rifle is a semi-automatic rifle. This means that you can fire it significantly faster and it holds 6 rounds. It's not crazy fast though. It's not like what you would think of with a gun in real life these days that would go like boom, 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 being semi-automatic. We're talking about a semi-automatic gun that goes boom, crank it, boom, crank it. It's about 3 to 4 times as fast as the bolt action. Let's just put it that way. It's faster, but it's not that much faster. Composite armor, gonna be straight with you. It is a total waste of time. You could just be running exotic armor, which is just straight up better than it. And it is so much better. I would just tell you, to be quite frank, stay away from it. It is not worth your time to craft and spend blueprints on. Now, these other things over here you're going to need for some specific missions. The portable beacon, the extractor, and the radar are all going to be needed for very specific missions. If you don't have them unlocked, you'll get them unlocked when you get to those missions, but they are going to be important to get at that stage. The biofuel generator, you have to get it to get to all the other stuff, so it's important. But either way, it is important for some missions. Same with the electricity tool, you're going to need that for some missions, but again, none of this stuff so far is absolutely necessary until you get to a mission that actually asks for you to use them. The electric furnace, same thing here. They are useful if you really have a super long-term mission, but otherwise only going to use them for the missions that you're doing and probably nothing else. Same with the material processor, same with the composite paste, same with the directional work lamps. You only get these because you need them for a mission in order to complete a mission. Solar panel, same thing. Electric deep mining drill. This is one of the few things in tier 4 that do have potential to be used outside of just mission-based situations. If you're gonna play super long term on a mission, like we're talking a week probably, or 20 hours or more of game time, it could be worth getting. Otherwise, gonna be honest, it's not really worth it whatsoever. The chemistry bench, once again, I would say just stay away from it. The electricity carpentry bench, I would just stay away from it. Electricity masonry bench, I'd stay away from it. Electricity composter is one of the few things, once again, that could be useful long-term because it just makes biofuel faster. But you could also build 4 biofuel composters in the time it would take you to farm the materials to build one of these. So I would just do that instead. But again, I'm going to leave this one up to you guys. I would say stay away from most of what is in tier 4, to be honest with you, until you need it for missions. The last thing that we do want to mention is the refrigerator. And that is just simply because the refrigerator is an electronic powered icebox that will keep your food essentially alive for as long as you can provide it power. Until we have other things though, tier 4 is honestly one of the worst tiers in the entire game. And that's just because there's no missions that really require you to use any of these items. And by the time you get to them, you've already completed the mission. So there's no point in crafting them anyways. Once again, there are some things in here you will need to complete certain missions. So I understand getting those ones. And those are going to be things like your biofuel generator, electricity tool, these things up here, your electric furnace, your material processor, etc., etc. But until it requests you to actually get that thing, I would tell you, go back to tier 3, go back to tier 2, go back to tier 1, and spend your blueprint points on things that you can use now. This is where once you hit tier 4, I would just tell you, go back to tier 1, 2, and 3, spend them on things that you might have wanted or things that you could use that you may not use all the time, but you'd actually use once in a while. Because there are tons of things in tier 4 that are honestly basically just completely useless. With all of that being said though, I do hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you want to see more Icarus content as well as other survival game content, do consider subscribing to our channel. Maybe check out our membership program if you want to support us. Absolutely not required. There is no push for you to do that. I just like to let people know because a lot of people don't know it even exists. It's right next to that subscribe button too. So if you want to check it out. And if not, that's okay too. I am Game Advisor though. Thank you so much for watching this video. We could not do this without you guys, and we are so appreciative of every single one of our viewers. Thank you once again, and I'll see you next time.